I heard of once in a lullaby.
Hi there. You know, Judy Garland was a very interesting person. She died way too young. She had a very tragic life in many ways, but she's fascinating, and boy, did she have the vocal pipes. I think if you're going to sum up her life, you'd use two words: ruby slippers and love. She was born Frances Ethel Gumm, later known as Judy Garland. She was born in 1922 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and she died in June of 1969 in London. She was 47 years old when she died, and she died from an overdose. It was a death that many saw coming, but no one could stop. Those ruby slippers really are iconic for a lot of different reasons. When people think of the Wizard of Oz, they think of those, and they think of Toto, her dog, and they think of the characters that she met in the Land of Oz, and they think of her song. The Wizard of Oz is so directly associated with her, and it happened so early in her life that she really never shook the persona of Dorothy. A kind of an innocent, childlike woman. And she remained that way all the way through until her death. In The Wizard of Oz, which is based on Frank Baum's book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Dorothy is transported into a land of fantasy and imagination called Oz, and it's overseen, it's controlled completely by three entities. One, the wizard, and two, the good witch of the East, and three, the witch of the West, who was bad. She and her dog Toto leave Kansas, they enter this imaginary space, and they take us with them into a wonderful land where imagination is the most important thing. Garland's life was anything but a happy fantasy. She was unhappy. She was lonely, both during her childhood and as an adult. She became hooked on drugs very early, and then because of that drug use and other issues, psychological, many of them, she became depressed and had to fight depression through most of her life. But she had an amazing voice, and she had an amazing stage presence. And so, when we look at her life, the one question we really have to ask is, what happened to her? To find that answer, I looked at a number of biographical pieces, and I settled on one which was published in 2001. It's by Gerald Clark. It's called Get Happy: The Life of Judy Garland. He did two biographies for which he's very well known. One was Capote, about Truman Capote, and the other was this one, The Life of Judy Garland. He was a magazine writer primarily, and he also was a senior editor-writer at Time magazine. Clark, in the biography Get Happy, is very good at including important quotations by Judy Garland that sort of emphasize what was going on with her in her life. One that I particularly was touched by is this one. Garland said, "When I was a child, more than anything else, I wanted to be loved by my parents." Now you can take that and you can add it, when I was an adult, I wanted more than anything else to be loved by a man. Her parents were fascinating people. They were vaudeville professionals in a time when vaudeville was hot. It was an important thing. This is a picture of their three daughters, the Gumm sisters. The oldest one is called Mary Jane, the middle one Dorothy Virginia, and the youngest was Frances Ethel, whom we will know later as Judy. In 1924, Frances, who was nicknamed Baby Gum and Babe, joined her two older sisters on stage for her very first public appearance. She was 2.5 years old. I love this picture of the three of them. They really are something like stair steps, and they really did perform pretty well. If you look closely at this picture, you'll notice that the two older sisters have their knees knocked together, but Judy, ever the individual, has hers separated. Babe joined her sisters in a song and dance routine, and they performed at one of the theaters that their father owned or managed. And the first routine was called When My Sugar Walks Down the Street. Babe's first solo was Jingle Bells, and she performed in a white net dress that her mother had created for her. The sisters performed throughout northeast and north central Minnesota from 1924 to 1926, and that's where they perfected their act. In 26, the Gum family moved to California. The mother decided that California was the way to make real money, that the movies were happening, things were happening, and that's where she wanted the girls to be. There, the sisters were given lessons in acting and dancing. And Ethel served as not only their mother, but also their manager and their agent. So she booked the trio for as many jobs as she would get them into. And she didn't have any real concern for their physical well-being or their mental well-being. By the late 1920s, the Gum sisters had appeared also in several little short films. This picture of them is taken in 1935. You can see now that they have matured. Mary Jane is the top left, Dorothy Virginia top right, and Frances Ethel, or Babe, is at the bottom. They have become young women. They're no longer children as such. In 1934, at the World's Fair in Chicago, the Gum sisters were transformed. They played at a theater where comedian George Jessel was also playing. Jessel realized their talent, especially Babe's, and he suggested that they needed a better marquee name than Gum, and he suggested Garland. And they adapted it, and as soon as they did, Babe decided that she would be Judy. She didn't want to be Babe anymore, and she didn't want to share her mother's name, Ethel. This picture of Ethel with her children is almost idyllic. They're all pretty faces, happy faces. It's meant intentionally to show a very happy, carefree family. It's really a lovely photo, but it's far from the truth. Make no mistake, this family put the D in dysfunctional. Ethel was living her life vicariously through her daughters, and she was dependent on their money to be able to get ahead. And because of that, she was making sure they performed whenever and wherever and whatever she said. In Be Happy, Gerald Clark writes this: "Then, even before she had reached her 10th birthday, did Babe become acquainted with the drugs that were to be her companions evermore. And her mother, her guardian, her defender, her shield against the world, made the introductions." In November 1935, Judy became a solo act for the first time. She sang "Zing Went the Strings of My Heart," a song that would become closely associated with her throughout her career, and she sang it on a radio broadcast. 1935 was really a turning point in her life and in her career. Shortly after the radio program played, Judy's father, Frank, died from spinal meningitis. It crushed her because she had always felt closer to her father than to her mother, although she spent much more time with her mother than her father. Her mother went on rather quickly to marry her longtime lover, Will Gilmore, just a year later, and happened to marry him on the first anniversary of Frank's death. All three of the daughters loathed him. Frank was the parent Judy had truly loved, and he was her favorite of the three Gum sisters. She felt his loss very deeply for the rest of her life, and many of the scholars suggest that the fact that she married so many times and had so many difficulties with her love life was because she was trying hard to replace him in her life. One of the primary reasons that Judy was allowed to become a solo artist was because her mother realized that she could make more money with Judy than she could with the trio. A second reason, which I think was just as important, is that the two older sisters were more than ready to get out of the act and get out from under Mama. One of them married, the older one married rather quickly after they split up the trio. Judy signed a movie contract with MGM, which at the time was the major studio. She was 13 years old. She's just barely a teenager. And suddenly she has a movie contract. And of course, MGM recognized they had something special in that voice, so they cast her quickly in a musical. The musical that MGM placed her in was called Pigskin Parade, 1936. In it, Judy plays Sari Dodd. She's a little farm girl, and she's always trying to get to sing in public, and nobody will pay much attention to her. It was her first feature role. She's always been a singer and a dancer. This time she's an actress as well. MGM loaned her to 20th Century Fox to make the film, and it was the only time that MGM ever loaned her out. Also appearing in the film was Jack Haley Jr. He's going to be back. He's going to join Judy when he plays the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz. The Pigskin Parade got some pretty good press. This is a review from 1937 by Hubbard Keeley in his column. He wrote, "Judy Garland, for my money, was the hit of Pigskin Parade, although Stuart Erwin shouldn't be forgotten. Judy, only 14, makes most crooning ladies of more years seem like beginners." See, they're already picking up on the voice. Then the following year, she appears in Love Finds Andy Hardy, and she's teamed for the first time with the person who will make up with her what MGM will call its dream team, Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney. She plays the girl next door. It's a very stereotypical part, and it's one that's going to cling to her for a number of years. Mickey Rooney plays the boy who's looking for the gorgeous girl, and he likes the Garland character, but he likes her as a sister, not as a girlfriend. Garland and Rooney grew up on the MGM lot, literally grew up as two of the MGM kids. They were very close friends then and later, but never were lovers. In Be Happy, Clark writes this, "MGM has established the persona that will remain with Judy almost to the end of her screen career. She's the wholesome girl next door, the sensitive soulmate boys like but do not lust after, the understanding friend to whom they confide their troubles with prettier, sexier girls. Metro, in short, was asking her to play a girl much like Judy Garland, and its writers had an uncanny knack of providing her characters with lines she herself might have spoken. She was working a lot. All the MGM kids had to work a lot. She was making films, but Judy, in addition, was recording as a solo vocalist. Her voice was that of a very mature woman, and that's okay, except her body was still saying preteen, and so it made it a problem, a paradox really, for MGM to figure out how to use her, what role she should be in. They couldn't quite wrap their head around her being an adult. Ethel, her mother, manager, agent, became increasingly worried because she was seeing other MGM kids' careers just evaporate when they became adults. And she was worried that maybe her daughter's career might end up that way. A child actor who was never heard again after puberty. That was a real possibility. And for Ethel, that was a real threat. Slate.com had this to say about Garland and Rooney. Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney had more than discarded birth names in common. He was not Mickey Rooney to begin with. Both were short and cherubic-looking teens who had been performing with their vaudeville families since they could talk. Both came from homes that their troubled fathers had broken, forcing the kids to go to work to help the single mothers stay afloat. For other stars, MGM was a home away from home. For Mickey and Judy, it was home instead of home. Judy and her mother became closer in the sense that now she only had one act to care for, one talent to be the agent for. So her mother focused closely on Judy Garland. Judy's build was different. She had a very short trunk and she had incredibly long legs. And she had a tendency to gain weight if she was under stress, and she's in a very high-stress environment. She stood only 4 feet 11 and a half inches tall, and her weight would show. MGM encouraged her mother, to keep giving amphetamines to her daughter to boost her energy, but also to help her lose weight. Her mother had begun giving her daughter uppers when she was a little bit before 10, and as she grew older, Garland herself added drugs to help her sleep. Ultimately, Judy Garland will become an alcoholic and an addict, and her addictions eventually ended her acting career and literally killed her. Her quote in Town and Country magazine in an article by Paul Donnelly is sad, and it's very revealing of the kind of life that she and Mickey Rooney and the other studio kids were living. She said, "They had us working days and nights on end. They'd give us pills to keep us on our feet long after we were exhausted. Then they'd take us to the studio hospital and knock us out with sleeping pills. Co-star Mickey Rooney sprawled out on one bed and me on another," Garland said. "Then after 4 hours, they'd wake us up, give us the pep pills again so we could work 72 hours in a row. Half of the time we were hanging from the ceiling, but it was a way of life for us." That's tragic. Mickey Rooney described it this way. He said, "Judy turned to drugs because she was in pain and because drugs made her feel good. As one of the MGM kids, she'd been treated for most of her life to magical, instant solutions to everything. She could never accept herself, so she was always on the run." Cher on X, not so very long ago, made this comment: "Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney were given speed to work and downers to sleep. It was a crime. Louis Mayer should have been put in jail." Those ruby slippers, in many ways, not only transported Dorothy to the land of Oz, they transported Judy Garland into major movie star status. The role that assured her stardom was the role of Dorothy. You know, it was kind of funny. I wanted to look at how much all these people were paid because they're an interesting group of folks. You've got some senior level actors. You have Judy Garland, who's relatively new, but she's got the voice and she's got the presence on stage. But then you have the Munchkins. Remember the Munchkins?
Ding dong, the witch is dead. Which, oh, which, the wicked witch. Ding dong, the wicked witch is dead. Wake up, you sleepy head. Rub your eyes, get out of bed. Wake up, the wicked witch is dead.
Terry, the terrier, played the role of Toto, and he was paid $125 a week. Judy Garland, who played Dorothy, made a little over $500 a week. The Munchkins, despite the fact that they did singing, they did dancing, and they took on multiple roles, they only earned $50 a week. They were paid less than Toto. And the total cost of The Wizard of Oz, which is magnificent in terms of the special effects of the time and the strange, opulent way that Oz was created. At the time, it cost $2,777,000, which was a fortune. In today's dollars, that's over $46 million. The Wizard of Oz took 10 weeks to film. MGM was using a relatively new process called Technicolor. Technicolor required more light, and so the stage temperature was often over 100 degrees. This compounds the problem that the main characters are all wearing very heavy costumes and very heavy makeup. Margaret Hamilton played the Wicked Witch, and she did it well. She was badly burned on the set. If you remember from the film, she just goes poof when she disappears and great fire happens. Well, it turns out it was real fire, and it caught her on fire. It caught her dress, it caught her hat, it caught her broom, and it burned her face rather badly. It took 6 weeks for her to heal sufficiently to be able to return to the film. The burns were not her only problem, though. The green face paint was very toxic, and so she and some other actors on the set, including the Tin Man, who had a similar makeup, only his was silver, they couldn't eat once it was applied, and so they had to subsist on liquid drawn through a straw for the whole day, or as long as the taping took. Her face stayed green for weeks after shooting because it was a copper-based ingredient and it couldn't come off. It just had to wear off. Bert Lahr had a different kind of a problem. He was probably more miserable than anybody else on the set because his costume was constructed out of actual lion pelts, and it weighed nearly 90 pounds. So in between each take, he took it all off just so he could breathe, and then he would put it back on. His facial makeup was also very thick, and it was enhanced by pieces of brown paper bag to create the texture that they wanted. Ray Bolger had to wear prosthetics on his face to create that scarecrow look. These prosthetics left lines on his face, and those took more than a year to disappear completely. Jack Haley's Tin Man costume presented some very interesting challenges because even simple movements were very difficult for him. When he cries, the audience assumes that it's machine oil that must be flowing down his cheeks. Wrong. It was chocolate syrup. A little movie trivia. Jack Haley Jr., whose father was the Tin Man, married Judy Garland's daughter, Liza Minnelli. To create the horse of a different color, MGM stuck Jello crystals all over the several horses on set who were playing the part. They discovered, though, that they had to shoot those scenes very, very quickly because the horses discovered that the crystals were very tasty and they would lick them off. Dorothy's blue and white dress in gingham was actually pink because it was easier to see or photograph in Technicolor. Her ruby slippers were originally made in silver, just as in Baum's book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, they're silver. MGM head Louis Mayer decided that since he was going to spend all this money on Technicolor, why not take advantage of them and make them bright red? Dorothy had her own costume issues. By now, she is becoming womanly, and so she had to shoot the entire film wearing an upper body corset that made her appear to be a flat-chested child, which she was not. 1939 to 1940, The Wizard of Oz created a national sensation and a national star. Judy received a special Academy Award. It's a juvenile Oscar, and it was for her work as Dorothy. By 1940, she was listed among the top 10 box office stars. On the set, while shooting Oz, Judy had difficult times. She was, of course, in an uncomfortable outfit, as I've described. But in the 1930s, because the child actors were routinely fed drugs, she was taking drugs. She was given drugs to keep her weight down, some to keep her awake. She was also forced to drink liquids during the filming because they thought if she drank liquids, she wouldn't gain as much weight. Maybe she'd even lose some weight. This kind of control over her life probably helped her during the filming process, but it left her a drug addict, and she was unable to see her own body. She became obsessed with weight, with her overall appearance, for the rest of her life. Filming The Wizard of Oz certainly made her career, but it also certainly ruined her life. In Be Happy, Clark writes, "From the time I was 13, there was a constant struggle between MGM and me, whether or not to eat, how much to eat, what to eat. I remember this more vividly than anything else about my childhood." By 1944, she is a young woman, and she is beautiful. She doesn't know it. She can't see it because she's been so browbeaten about weight and appearance and being perfect that she now has a visual distortion of herself. She was growing up, and she was growing up very quickly. The demure girl child, Dorothy in Oz, was now a full-fledged woman, and she was determined that she was going to get some control over her own life. And she was determined that she would be taken seriously as a romantic lead. Judy was ready. MGM was not. The studio heads were still not ready to break her out of a stereotypical girl next door role. They put her in Babes in Arms. She's cast as the sister best friend, but not the romantic lead that she wanted. She was paired with Mickey Rooney, always a draw. And the film itself had been adapted from a very successful Broadway play. It became Garland's second hit film. She made several more musicals. She made two with Rooney, Strike Up the Band and Babes of Broadway. And then she made one with Gene Kelly, For Me and My Gal, 1943. Gene Kelly, this was his first film, and he spoke later in his career about his experience making a movie for the first time and about Judy Garland's influence on him. This is what Kelly wrote. "Without Judy Garland, my first few weeks would have been even more miserable than they were. She pulled me through. She was very kind and helpful, more than she ever realized, because I watched her to find out what I had to do. I was amazed at her skill. She knew every mark and every move. All I could do for her was help with the dancing. She wasn't a dancer, but she could pick up a step instantly, and as a singer, she was incredible. She had only to hear the melody once, and it was locked in her mind. I learned a great deal about making movies doing this first one, and much of it was due to Judy. She was very relaxed, a marvelous person, the most talented performer we've ever had. Now that she was in her late teens, Garland was even more ready to get married. She wanted a husband. It would be obviously a very daring move because MGM told its stars when they could marry, who they could date, and so forth. And her mother, of course, had her own ideas about who Judy would ultimately marry. So Judy decided she would search herself for adult love, particularly a man who could give her the emotional support and unconditional love that her father had given her. And she finds David Rose, her first husband. They were married from 1941 to 1944. He was a very successful composer, orchestra leader. He'd been asked early on to do some arranging for her earliest recordings as a vocalist. The music brought them together. She was 19, he was 31. Good distance there. He's the older man who could look out for her. Her mother opposed the match. MGM opposed the match. So she and Rose simply eloped. That's how you handle that. The marriage was doomed, though, because Rose was a very quiet, reserved, contemplative fellow. Garland was a party girl. She's ready to go play. She loves to dance. She wants to have a life. She also wanted to start a family immediately. She became pregnant, but her mother and David Rose didn't want a child to be born, and so she underwent an abortion. Clark gives the details to this very sad chapter in Garland's life, and the couple divorced in 1944. That same year, she made Meet Me in St. Louis. She co-starred with Margaret O'Brien, very popular child star of the time, and it was a real hit. There were 3 songs that she sang in the film that became classics because of her. One was The Boy Next Door. Second was the Trolley Song. And the third, my favorite, Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. It was a very difficult movie to make from the beginning to the end, but still some good came out of it. A second love story. Second husband was Vincent Minnelli. They married in 46 and divorced in 51. Minnelli made Garland give up her girl next door image. It's what she wanted to do. He helped her do it. He helped her to begin projecting more sophistication in her look. She was 23, he was 42. They married in late 45, early 46, the numbers are juggled, and worked together, making 2 more movies. This marriage was doomed too. Garland was insecure. Even though she wanted to be more sophisticated, she wasn't terribly comfortable with sophistication. She also was suffering with depression because she had 1 failed marriage behind her. She had some sad events from that marriage, which were terrible for her. She was also self-medicating now with amphetamines and sleeping pills. In spite of all that, in March 1946, the Minnellis' only child, Liza, was born. MGM ultimately fired her after a 15-year contractual arrangement. Garland suffered a nervous breakdown. She twice attempted suicide, but once again she fell in love. They divorced in 1951. MGM had dropped Garland's contract because of her mental and physical problems, and they declared that she was totally undependable, and that made her a pariah in the movie-making business. The top studio had declared she was not worth taking a chance on. She was exhausted from constantly working and constantly medicating. But in 1951, she met businessman and producer Sid Luft and decided to resurrect her career. It was an act of will. This marriage to husband number 3 lasted from 1952 to 1965. He was a very successful businessman. He had met Garland first when she was just 15. 14 years later, they started dating. They married in June of '52 and stayed together for 13 years. It was her longest relationship in a marriage ever. Luft produced Garland's show on Broadway at the Palace Theater, which ran over 20 weeks to huge crowds. This is the resurrection of Judy. If she can run a show for 20 weeks, by golly, she's dependable. She shows up every time. She does her work. She's dependable. She demonstrated a work ethic that had been missing for a very long time, and she convinced not only her fans that she was back, she convinced other filmmakers that she was back, that she was in control of her life, and she could do it. In 1954, even though the marriage by this time was rocky, Luft was the key to putting together what many believe was Garland's greatest movie, even better than The Wizard of Oz. It's called A Star is Born. Her co-star was James Mason, very well-known actor, very respected actor. The vocal that she sings in this, one of them, but the vocal that she sings in this particular movie that many consider to be the best vocal performance on film by Garland throughout her whole career was The Man That Got Away. She was nominated for an Academy Award. She couldn't stop drinking. She couldn't stop taking the drugs. The marriage was marred by her addiction, additional suicide attempts, and constant dieting. They divorced in May of 1965. During the 1960s, Garland actually sang more than she acted. In '61, she won Grammy Awards for Best Solo Vocal Performance and for Album of the Year for her Judy at Carnegie Hall. These were the only Grammy Awards that Garland ever won, in spite of that spectacular voice. She tried for a while to have her own television series, The Judy Garland Show, but it was pretty much a nondescript. She had her children on it, Lorna and Liza. Mickey Rooney even made some guest appearances, but it couldn't last. Husband number 4 appears in 1965. His name is Mark Herron. He's a minor actor, but he's a tour promoter. They married unofficially during the summer of 1964, but made it official in November of 1965. One thing that's true about Judy Garland is she's not a stickler for details like a particular kind of marriage ceremony or whatever. She just decides she's married and she is. Herron produced Garland's 2 London Palladium concerts in 1964 with Liza, and they were enormous successes. The couple went on to divorce in '67, with Garland testifying that Herron had beaten her and he denied the charge. Husband number 5 appears in 1969. He is Mickey Dean. He's the first one who's younger than she is. He's a musician. He's a former band leader. He's a disco club manager. And supposedly, in Clark's book, pretty well documented, he supplied her with some of the amphetamines. They dated infrequently for 3 years, and then he proposed, and they married on March 15th, 1969. He was 35. She was 47. She died several months later on June 22nd, 1969. Just 1 year prior to her death, Garland said, "I'm the queen of the comeback. I'm getting tired of coming back. I really am. I can't even go to the powder room without making a comeback." The last decade of Judy Garland's life was one filled with unimaginable stress. There was the problem with the drugs. There was the problem with the marriages. There was the problem with her children. There was the problem with money. And most important, there was still Judy's enormous need to find someone who would love her for herself. She said, quote, "In the silence of the night, I have often wished for just a few words of love from one man rather than the applause of thousands of people." Her mother must take the blame for much of what went wrong in Judy's later life because the seeds were sown when the child was just a child. Judy Garland herself described it this way: "My mother had a marvelous talent for mishandling money, mine. When I was put under stock contract at Metro and had a steady income for the first time, we lived in a 4-unit apartment building. I suggested to Mother that we buy it as an investment and rent the other 3 apartments. She hit me in the mouth and invested the money in a nickel mine in Needles, California that has never been found. We never got a nickel back." Financial mismanagement of her earnings plus her addictions left Garland very heavily in debt. Several years before her death, she was informed by the IRS that she owed back taxes of $500,000. Desperate to earn money, she performed in New York, the Palace Theater, at Boston Common, and back to New York to perform shows at Madison Square Gardens. Most of her earnings, though, although she appeared to be doing very well, the earnings were being seized by the IRS. In 1969, she accepts a run at London's Talk of the Town. This was putting her across the pond and giving her a fresh start. Her run was a disaster. She was too skinny from too many pills. She smoked and drank while she was on stage performing, and she often called her younger husband, Dean, on stage to be with her. Her speech was slurred. The audience actually threw things on stage in protest. Her final concert appearance was in Copenhagen. She repeated the same songs she had sung in London and closed with Over the Rainbow. Peter Quilter, playwright, wrote this: "In 6 weeks, at the Talk of the Town, everything came to a head. It was her emotional car crash." According to Colin Bertram in biography.com, he wrote, "Dean's, this is the final husband, found his wife dead on the bathroom of their London rental. Her cause of death was ruled as accidental, an overdose of barbiturates that had been ingested over a long period of time, and that no evidence suggested she had committed suicide. Garland died 12 days after her 47th birthday." And there are a lot of people who argue that it was obviously suicide without really paying too much attention to what the coroner's report says. The coroner's report is saying that basically, my interpretation, if it were suicide, she had been killing herself for decades with the abuse of the drugs, and her body had just finally got to the point it couldn't handle it anymore. James Mason delivered her eulogy at the funeral. The story went worldwide because even though she had been on the skids, she was still remembered as Dorothy, and she was remembered as A Star is Born. I mean, she still had presence in the minds of the viewing audiences. Mason said this in the eulogy: "Judy's great gift was that she could wring tears out of the hearts of rocks. She gave so richly and so generously that there was no currency in which to repay her. She adored her children. She had basically 3 kids who each chose to live their lives in their own way. Liza's the one about which we know the most because she was the most visible. She was a very successful entertainer, and she was excellent at both acting and singing. Her most acclaimed role was that of Sally Bowles in the 1972 hit musical Cabaret. Cabaret was astonishing. If you haven't seen her in that, you need to. Like her mother, though, Liza married and divorced multiple times. She never had any children. The second child, Lorna Luft, some of us will know because of the autobiography that she wrote. Others of us may be aware of her singing career. She did a lot of singing as a backup singer. Her autobiography, Me and My Shadows, a family memoir, came out in 1998, and it was a television miniseries in 2001. Lorna remained very close to Liza. Their brother, Joey Luft, pretty much remained unseen and mostly unheard. He generally avoided the limelight. In her later years, none of Garland's children remained close to Garland. Liza refused her phone calls. Lorna wrote the tell-all autobiography. Joey eventually created a one-man show that he took on the road. It was about his mother and his childhood. In spite of everything, including herself, Judy Garland had an amazing career. She starred in 30 television shows. She earned 10 Emmy nominations. She appeared as a guest on 30 other television shows. She performed over 1,100 theater, nightclub, and concert performances from 1951 to 1969. She did several hundred radio broadcasts, and she sang at benefits for the military during World War II. She recorded nearly 100 singles and over 24 albums. You know, one cannot help but wonder what her career might have been without the challenges she faced beginning in early childhood. Judy Garland, 1922, 1969. Throughout her career, the one song that was most closely identified with her was Over the Rainbow. Interestingly, she chose to end every live performance that she gave, even to the very end of her life, by singing that song, which she called her anthem. That's a haunting thought for all Garland fans, or should be. She said, "I've always taken The Wizard of Oz very seriously, you know. I believe in the idea of the rainbow, and I've spent my entire life trying to get over it."
It's far, far away. Behind the moon, beyond the rain.
Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a land that I heard of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams that you dare